Welcome back everybody to another episode of Direct Comparison, and to celebrate the release of the new remastered PS4 and Xbox One version of Far Cry 3, we're going to see how well that game stacks up to the most recent entry in the franchise, Far Cry 5. For this video, we're going to be playing them both on the PC, with the graphics cranked up to their max values at a 1440p resolution and an unlocked frame rate. Alright, so to start this comparison off, we're going to take a look at some texture comparisons. Now, the environments are pretty different between these two games, with one being on a fictional Rook Island out in the Pacific, while the other takes place in a fictional Hope County somewhere in Montana. But it's still pretty clear that there's significantly more advanced texture designs in the most recent Far Cry, especially when you look at things like the environmental trees, rocks, and ground. The one thing that really stands out to me are the rock textures. Far Cry 3 had an interesting cartoon-like aesthetic to it that made every object in the world pop thanks to its odd cel-shaded outlined approach. It's not a bad looking design, but Far Cry 5 certainly goes for a more lifelike approach to its visuals. This is even more evident with Far Cry 5's approach to lighting. In Far Cry 3, the world is bright and vibrant, almost too vibrant, even for a tropical setting. Far Cry 5, however, aims for a more realistic global illumination, and the enhanced volumetric light shafts really help to add to that. The color palette in Far Cry 5 is warmer and closer to what you'd expect in reality, but I do still really like the overall aesthetic Far Cry 3 went with, and I love how the objects and colors pop to really bring out that tropical feeling. The shadows in both games aren't really anything that impressive, though Far Cry 5 does seem to do a better job hiding some of the odd artifacting when it comes to casting smaller details. Far Cry 3's palm tree shadows look fine at first glance, but when you get up really close, you begin to see some obvious shimmer and odd artifacting lines that don't appear natural. This is still present in Far Cry 5, but it's not nearly as easy to identify. Next, let's look at some similar gun models to see if there were any drastic changes in the past 6 years. The weapon models in Far Cry 5 have a bit more detail to them. The newer camera angle also helps to make the firearms in general look less bulky, which definitely helps because weapons like the AK-47 always looked a bit weird in Far Cry 3. The muzzle flash has been reduced in Far Cry 5 to give it more of a realistic appearance, but it hasn't been removed entirely. And whenever there is a muzzle flash in Far Cry 5, the sprite used to display it looks pretty simplistic when compared to the brighter muzzle flashes in Far Cry 3. But these are all incredibly minor and barely noticeable changes when compared to the flamethrower. Far Cry 5 looks significantly better when it comes to its fire effects leaving the flamethrower. Far Cry 3's effect looks like a basic ball of bright orange fire and doesn't even feel like it's connected to the weapon itself. But Far Cry 5 has a much more advanced stream of fire that looks much more impressive. Now let's look at how the game's sound design differs when firing these weapons. Which game do you guys think sounds better? For this next part, we're going to be taking a look at various visual effects, including particles, smoke, and dynamic environments. To test this, we're going to throw a few standard explosives and see how the world reacts to them. And oddly enough, both games seem to behave about the same. Trees react only a little bit to explosives in both games, more so in Far Cry 3, but the actual fireball from the C4 in Far Cry 5 does look a bit more detailed. What's interesting is that the C4 in Far Cry 3 will actually start a forest fire, something that won't happen in Far Cry 5. As for fire propagation, I emptied an entire tank of the flamethrower near a group of trees in both games, and was surprised to see about the same results. The fire has been redesigned to appear more realistic, with less orange and more yellow coloration, and more complex looking sprites. But the actual spread of the fire seems to be the same despite entirely different vegetation and climate in this new setting. And finally, we have a comparison of the water effects. Far Cry 3 is loaded with water simulation, being as the game takes place on a series of small islands. Personally, I feel like the water in Far Cry 3 does look a bit better, even if you ignore the brighter coloration, which can be difficult to look past. The actual ripples just look more realistic than the repeated patterns across the surface of the water in Far Cry 5. You can even see the seam where the pattern for the water shader is being repeated. But Far Cry 5 still has that nice dynamic ripple effect when wading around in the water that looks much nicer than the simple splashing sprite effect that occasionally appears when treading water in Far Cry 3. But that's pretty much it. Far Cry 3 still had an interesting visual direction, that, thanks to a highly stylized environment and some interesting cel-shaded based designs to its shadows, has aged very well. But thanks to the improvements made in Far Cry 4 and the subsequent changes made for Far Cry 5, the franchise now has a much more realistic appearance, with more lifelike lighting effects and believable color complexity. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and if you want to see more content like this, don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos posted every week.